Anyway, it's today we're looking at Daniel, and its persistent and sometimes hidden message of perseverance. And we've got a presentation for you today. Not yet, Rob, though. I'll shout over. You can put that front one on if you want, because it's all arty and Canva, thankfully, has helped me out, and we'll be able to discuss a few things. And actually, what we're going to do is, although we've had chapter 1 read to us, it's a bit of a too long book to go through chapter by chapter like we have done in some of our prophets. So we're kind of going to do an overview, I get quite excited about Daniel, I personally agree with what I understand most scholarship's position to be, which is that Daniel is one of the last books of the Hebrew canon to be written. It's a book that Jesus quotes a lot in his ministry, and I think actually it's quite a new book for the Jews to be running around with and to be talking about and to be engaging with. And that's basically what a lot of scholarship says as well. So when I say I think, I've read quite a few people, and that's the predominant understanding. And I'm like, these guys are smarter than me, and it's certainly where they land. So I think this book is a favourite Old Testament book for a lot of Christians. A lot of Christians love this book, and we do. Because I think that there is this whole idea that Daniel is talking about the end times, and it's all about this kind of crystal ball looking at like well into the distant future kind of thing. Reading, telling us all about Jesus, telling us all about not just Jesus' first coming, but also his second coming. And you get all this kind of crazy Daniel apocalyptic theology, eschatology, and teaching on the end times. And it's just a really, really, really popular book. I can remember when I lived over in the States, we were doing a really long study on eschatology with the young people, with our seniors in high school. And it was one of the elders who was doing this. I was asked to sort of sit alongside, and we often had some very interesting conversations. And I tell you, the amount of times that Daniel came up, and they're trying, they would pick out references from Daniel to fit alongside the eschatology. And it's really is something that we get hooked into very quickly. And it's just this really, really popular book. And if people are unfamiliar with it, and for those that are familiar with it, we're just pulling it out all the time. And you'll see, in fact, we've had a song, we sing it regularly. And actually, when I pointed something out to Rob just before the service was due to start, and about where we're going with this, and he was like, "Oh man, I'm going to change one of my songs." And so that first song that we had sung, "He's coming on the clouds," that's lifted straight out of Daniel. We're going to discover that in a little bit. But there's this interesting little dance that we have to do. See, Daniel, here. Many of us are familiar with Daniel, and we know the stories. We know the stories about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, don't we? Or do we know the stories about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We know those. But you see, I wish we didn't actually know those names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they are Babylonian names. They're not their Hebrew names. And I love that in chapter 1, they keep referencing back. And there's a reason for that, and we'll come on to that in a moment, to their Hebrew names. See, the names that they get given, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are names that praise Babylonian gods. And it's kind of given to them to shame them. And which is one of the reasons why I think actually we should kind of leave that in the past. But that's my own little soapbox. And you don't need me to sort of stand on those and have a little rant at you. But there we are. We have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we know all about them. They go into the furnace. We know about Daniel in the lion's den. In fact, again, back in the early 2000s, there was a song. I'll not sing it, but the line was, "I want to be like Daniel in the lion's den, waiting for God's love to save me." And I used to sing that, and I'm thinking, no, I wouldn't actually. On retrospect, maybe I want the faith, and I think that's what it's trying to say. I want the faith like that, but I don't want to be like Daniel in the lion's den. I think, that would be a little bit scary, wouldn't it? And some of you may know about the Daniel fast. That's actually not just a Christian thing. That's gone out into the wider world. You can go into the works and you can find a copy of the Daniel fast. Now, most people don't realize that actually this is a biblical thing. But it's gone beyond Christian walls, and it's a sort of seen as a way of encouraging healthy eating, because as we heard in chapter 1, they glow and are more radiant than every young man because of the food that they're eating and the way that they're dealing with it. So there's loads of stuff going on. We may know about Daniel praying in the window and what happens with that. We know about the statues and even some of the visions, even some of the apocalyptic visions in Daniel. I think actually overall we could be quite familiar with this. I hope some of you are, at the very least, because I'm kind of made an assumption that you are as I'm talking. But don't worry, we're going to unpack a whole bunch of stuff. Essentially, Daniel is an absolute treasure trove. And it's a goldmine of literary stuff of things that are just going on under the surface. Like a lot of the things that we talk about, we can read stuff at a surface level, and that's great. And we can get loads of understanding, loads of revelation, loads of encouragement and words from God. But actually, there's so much going on underneath. There's so much stuff that's going to be unpacked. So let's start to dig in. So first of all, Daniel is the only book in the Bible that is written in two completely separate languages. And as like I said, there is a reason why we get the first. You come to get me a shop? Awesome. There's a reason why in chapter 1 we have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those names repeated quite a few times. And that's because chapter 1 is written in English. No, it's not. It's written in Hebrew. And then it switches to Aramaic for chapters 2 to 7. And the book, it starts, Aramaic was the Semitic language, the common language of the day. It's the language of everybody. And it was like the language that anybody in that part of the world would have spoken. And you can think of it as a secular language. It's kind of like the English of today on the whole. Or maybe the Spanish in certain parts of the world. Where it kind of, most, like, because of empire and because of all sorts of stuff, our language is commonly spoken nowadays. Not always spelt the same, but commonly spoken. And this book, it starts off in Hebrew. And Hebrew is the language of God's people. Yeah? Good stuff. Hebrew is the Jewish language of God's Jewish people. And then you have Aramaic. Why do you think, what's your hunch? What's going on in this? Why do you think they split the book into two halves? And then the back half switches back into Hebrew. So you've got chapter 1 in Hebrew, chapter 2 to 7 in Aramaic, and then chapter 8 to whatever it is, I can't remember offhand, and I'm trying to look down, I can't see it in my notes. It switches back into Hebrew. Any guesses? It is a chiasm thing, yes, because it's got an arts of chiasm. So, but it's not so much about the language. It's a little bit. So What are we in? We're in the exile period, aren't we? So you've got a people who start off in their homeland, who then go off into exile. And so as you're reading this book, and you start off in Hebrew, and then you get taken into exile, and suddenly you're speaking a common tongue, and you're reading in the common tongue, and then suddenly it switches back to Hebrew. What are you going to think as the reader? You're being brought back. Absolutely, absolutely. It speaks, even the language that it uses, it speaks a message of hope into the situation that they're in. And I just find that amazing. So if you're reading it as a Jewish reader, you know, and you're going to think that suddenly everything's going to be okay. We're going to come back. We're coming back into the language of God's people, and so we're going to be brought back into our homeland. There is this promise. And from a literary perspective, that alone, and that's just surface level, basic observation stuff that we don't get because ours is all written in English. But if when you engage with this in the original languages, all of this would just speak into our Jewishness that's been lost, into the hope of the future, and it's amazing, and it's beautiful, and that's how they're going to feel as they sit in exile. The book comes down on the hillside of hope in the language of the Hebrews. And you almost sense the message of restoration and hope without any of the content. Just simply by looking at the way that it's written. Just for language choice alone. And it's so affirmative in its perspective. But wait, we are saying that there's a first half and there's a second half of the book. But by this time in our journey, in fact, Margaret's already pointed it out. So if there's a first half and a second half, what are we kind of looking at? It's on the screen. Chiasms. Awesome. And we must have a chiasm on our hands. But in fact, we don't just have a chiasm, but the book of Daniel ends up being what's called the legendary double chiasm. Hold on to your hats. I get really excited about this kind of stuff because I'm a little bit of a geek. And what I mean by this is that we have a chiasm in the first half, chiasm A, and in the second half, half B, we have another chiasm, and then half A and half B form one giant chiasm, chiasm C. So we're going to go through that, and we're going to pick that up today, and have a look and see what it is that God wants to teach us. I love chiasms. The more I've studied this stuff, the more I've looked at this stuff, the more I realize you want to find out what the heart of God is all about, what his word is to his people. It's learning how to see and identify chiasms. And it's just such a beauty because we don't use them. As Westerns, we don't use them, but actually, as an Eastern text, as an Eastern people speaking into and a way to engage and understand this, chiasms just bring out this little thing that's hidden for us to discover. It's not hidden for us not to find, like, oh, you can't find this. But once you know these tools and these tricks, they're there to reveal the heart and nature of God, and it's amazing and beautiful. If I were to listen to this in this Aramaic Hebrew dance, I might think that chiasm A actually has a treasure for my time in exile. Because it's in Aramaic, isn't it? And chiasm B has a treasure for my return. Something for me to discover for my return, which means that the larger chiasm has to be what is it that we're all waiting for? What is the big idea that gets us from A to B? How is it going to realize all of this hope? That's what we're going to be looking for. So let's open up the presentation. First slide. And you probably have a representation of chiasm A, and you'll see that chapter 2, it mirrors chapter 7. So the idea is that it comes in and then back out again. So chapter 2 is all about, they both have this image of the kingdom. And one has a 4-part statue, and the other has the 4 different beasts. As you go through, let me encourage you to read Daniel this week and pick this stuff up for yourself, in amongst all the Christmas stuff that we're doing as well. It's not loads of reading. And chapter 2 mirrors chapter 6 with a refusal to worship. In chapter 3, they're thrown into the furnace. In chapter 6, Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, where we want to be, and we want to be. That's the little thing in that song. FFH, by the way, if you want to check out that song. That's who it's written by. Chapter 4 is the fall of Nebuchadnezzar, and chapter 5 is the fall of Belshazzar. And so that's your chiasm. And we don't have a whole lot of historical evidence. People argue about the historicity of Belshazzar as this sort of second in command and all that sort of stuff. We actually have a lot of extra biblical evidence about Babylon. Like, Babylon is this very, very well documented empire, but there's not a whole lot of reference about this incredibly powerful person called Belshazzar. But that's besides the point. It could be just this person that they're creating, or it could be a real historical person. But there's a conversation about Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar as a kind of similar thing that's going on there, that creates this persecution. And there's a lot of discussion going on, but there's definitely a chiasm between 2 and 7, 3 and 6, 4 and 5. So the question is, what's the center? That's what we should. When we discover these chiasms, we have to go, what is the center? What are we looking for? And if you've got a Bible in front of you, I forgot to put them out, so apologies if you don't. But if you go to Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. If you've not got a Bible in front of you, we're going to put it up on the screen. See, the center of a chiasm ends up being this. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right. All his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Which is crazy. Can you imagine Nebuchadnezzar saying these words? The author has these words coming out of the prideful, horrifically evil king Nebuchadnezzar, who saw himself as God on earth, who saw himself as like the ultimate, the pinnacle. I don't know if you've seen the movie 300, and where they're carrying. I mean, that's the next, not Nebuchadnezzar. That's the next king. That's Persia. That's Sirius, isn't it? But they're all framed on the same stuff. Where they're seen as this like deity, and that movie. Not, if you haven't watched it, I'm not recommending it. There is a point where he speaks, and he even kind of has this like weird tone to his voice, and it's because he's meant to be kind of like this demigod, god-like sort of statue kind of thing. And yet you've got him saying this. In Daniel, Daniel's got these words coming out of his mouth, which is crazy, absolutely crazy. Everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, which is what you are wrestling with as you speak Aramaic in exile in Babylon. Does God do the right things? Is he there for us? Is he good? Is he standing for us? Does he still love us? Does he still care for us? Why are we here? And that's the stuff we're wrestling with. And as God's way is just, and this evil king, almost like a drama, almost like a play, this evil king comes out with these words that are uttered, and comes out with this statement of truth. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right. All his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. There's nobody prouder than Nebuchadnezzar. And yet he's saying, this king, this one, he's the one who's able to humble me. So as a Jew, you hear, as a Hebrew, you hear, of course our God is good and just. And that leads us into the second half of this book. And so we get our second chiasm. And on our next slide, you'll see chiasm B. So we have, there we are, thanks Rob. We have chapter 8 mirroring chapter 11. You've got prophecies about beasts and prophecies about kings. And then chapter 9 and chapter 10 mirror each other. And that's about trials and forgiveness. Chapter 9 is about trials and forgiveness. Chapter 10 is about trials and mourning. And we have this going on, which leads us into the question, again, if we've got another chiasm, what's the center? So if you have a look in your Bibles, if you go to chapter 9 and you can look at verses 25 to 27, it says this. No one understands, oh, that's small, isn't it? Oh, that's all right on the big screen. No one understands this from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes. There will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble, after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. At the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. No problem with that, is it? Not at all confusing. It's incredibly confusing. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to put it into context for you. Because there's all this stuff going on, these 62 sevens, these sevens, and these middle of the sevens, all this sort of stuff. And there's loads of stuff written about this. Loads of conjecture. But the real center, the actual center is this. So if you look at verse 26 alone, it says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler will come and will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolation have been decreed. That's a passage that's gotten a ton of mileage in our end times discussions. If you're familiar at all with end times eschatology and all the conversations that surround this, there's so much speculation and so much discussion and argument, and depending on what position you take, whether you're pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, or anything like that. Just be careful, my little friend. There we are. It's there's loads of stuff going on. And I don't want to take away any allusions to the fact that actually we know this side of Jesus, that, we see Jesus in this passage. Absolutely. We see Jesus in this passage. The anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. That is Jesus, isn't it? He is the anointed one. He was put to death. Everything was stripped away from him. I mean, he took it back up again because he's Jesus. But that's, I don't want to take away the Jesus connection at all. But that's not my point. But this is not what the original writer, nor what the original audience would have heard when they read it, or heard it being read to them. We've talked about this a little bit before when we've read prophecy. We don't want to read it in a way that the original audience has to just scratch their head and go, I have got no idea what that means. because that's not how this works. There must be something for them in it. There must be something there that they will understand. And so on its primary focus, they must have been able to get something out of that, which is tricky in this regard, because the passage doesn't make much sense if Daniel is an exilic prophet. How is this message of the restoration of the temple, the corruption of a king, the destruction of that temple again, when it's already been destroyed? Because they're sitting in exile. So it doesn't make much sense. So how do you place this in history if you're in exile? And that's part of the reason why I think reason why I referenced earlier that I agree with modern scholarship in that actually it's kind of written years after, retrospectively. And they're able to look back and they're able to say, at this stage, this is what this is talking about. And so these two chiasms form this staggering, amazing double chiasm. And it stands to reason that the rest of this double chiasm would form a third greater chiasm that we will call chiasm C for this whole thing. And this is, there we are, Rob's already got it up, that's great. So if your head's not spinning yet, it will do. This is why I geek out so much on stuff like this, and I hope you kind of geek out a little bit. And if anything else, just pick up the centers. So you've got Nebuchadnezzar uttering those words out of his mouth about God humbling the proud. You've got the promise of the restoration of the kingdom. And this weird stuff about 62 sevens and all that sort of stuff, but this restoration and the king who comes and will be put to death and that, stuff. And so we've got our third one. And so as you can see, you've got chapter 1 and chapter 12, the prologue and the epilogue. They go hand in hand together. Chapter 2, mirroring chapter 11, prophecies about kingdoms. You've got God's people in suffering in chapter 3, mirroring God's people in suffering in chapter 10. Chapters 4 and 5, you have prophecies about a fall of a king, and chapters 9b is a prophecy about the fall of a king. Chapter 6 has God's people in suffering. Chapter 9a, we have God's people in suffering again. Chapter 7 and 8 end up lined up at the center, which are two chapters about prophecies of the beast. And one of them being in Aramaic, chapter 7, and one of them then being in Hebrew, chapter 8. Which is just, it's amazing. It's like, how does this all work out? Which means at the center, as it's been identified, and if I'm honest, particularly when you look at rabbinic teaching, there is not much disparity at all. They all go, this is the center. This is where we can anchor our point. And actually, this is something that we will hear come up time and time again. It's being spoken out of the mouth of Jesus. So when I tell you this in a moment, you'll go like, oh yeah, I understand. This is who it is. See, Jesus keeps referencing the book of Daniel, like I said, which may have been a really recent book, a very recent publication. Jesus is going to use it to do a whole heck of a lot of teaching. But the center of this whole thing, this big idea, ends up being chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. And it says this: in my vision at night, I looked up, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds in heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. The big idea of Daniel is, listen, in the midst of all your suffering, whether it's in Babylon suffering or whether it's in the Greco-Roman oppression or in the coming days, there is a day coming, insists Daniel, where somebody is going to come One like the Son of Man is going to come, and we'll come back to this in Jesus' ministry and Jesus' teaching. We'll pull this apart even more when we get to the Gospels. But he says there is a coming day where there is going to be a leader that comes. He's going to stand before God. And another reference in Daniel with a book of life in his hand, and he's going to give account. He's going to render judgment. He's going to make everything right. And Daniel insists that there's a day coming when everything will be made right to a group of people in exile. Or a later group of people in exile wondering just where is the justice of God. And if you're under oppression from the Romans as well, and you're thinking, where is the justice in God? We've come back and suddenly all our stuff's been taken away from us again, and we can't live as free people. But there is a day coming. There is a day coming. There is a chiasm buried here about the justice of God is coming. You have to persevere. You have to hang in there. You have to make it through, because all of your righteousness, all of your faithfulness, all of your good deeds, for this original audience, it's not going to be overlooked. It's not going to be empty, because one will come like a Son of Man, and will come in the clouds, and will make everything right in the world. How much do we need to hear that as well? And if we're honest, we don't live under very much oppression, do we? We get a little bit angry when, things get slightly secular and stuff, but we don't live under oppression. We're not like some of our brothers and sisters around the world who get thrown into prison and killed and beheaded and what have you because of their faith. How much do we need to stand with our brothers and sisters, though? To pray for the church in places like Iran and North Korea and China and Sudan and places like that. How much do we need to speak prophetically to our leaders as well about our brothers and sisters who are facing persecution, but know that actually there is a day coming where all things will be made right. Where the Son of Man will return. Where it's not going to be overlooked. It's not going to be empty, because he will come and make this world right. This is what Advent's about. I didn't plan for Daniel to come up the Sunday before Christmas. It's where it's fallen with all our breaks and stuff like that, and taking a bit of a break over summer. But it's wonderful that it's happened here, because it reminds us and it calls us forth. It becomes this big apocalyptic, you could even say eschatological, I can't say it. Thank you, eschatological. As soon as I knew I was going to stammer there, and as soon as I started to stammer on it, I'm like, it's never going to come out. We can, the assertion that everything will be made right. We know, even in our cushy Western world, things aren't right. Things aren't good. There's a lot of good, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of good, and we should be people of hope, who speak hope, who pull out gold, who call out the things, but we know that there's still a lot of injustice, a lot of addiction, a lot of crime, a lot of, all the stuff that we can list and we can go on about, but we get to speak prophetically about there's a time coming where all things will be made right. And there is a chiasm buried here about the justice of God is coming. You have to persevere. You have to hang in there. You have to have hope, because we have the greatest hope. You have to make it through, because all of your righteousness, all of your faithfulness, all of your good deeds, this is for the original audience, but this is for us as well. It's not going to be overlooked. It's not going to be empty, because one will come like the Son of Man. And it just gets swirled around and this teaching here in Daniel, and there is coming a day where somebody's going to stand before the Ancient of Days and is going to make a case and is going to put the world right. Daniel really becomes about the Son of Man, and this ends up being our word for Daniel is Son of Man. And again, I hope as soon as you hear that, you hear Jesus. Because he calls himself. That's why it's so triggering. And I love it because this would have been, I mean, we're not talking like yesterday that it was written in Jesus, but in comparison to maybe, Isaiah and Ezekiel and all that sort of stuff, this is much more recent text. And yet he takes this thought that they were wrestling with and playing with, and he applies it to himself. And it would have been so confrontational. So a final thought as we close out Daniel. He gives a prophecy of hope that at some point a leader would come and would establish a new kingdom, one that would never pass away. And in the meantime, God's people are left to stand strong in the face of suffering, to resist the pull and tug of empire, to stand and subvert a kingdom that attempts to make you bow to gods that are not your own. Daniel promises God's protection and rescue. Daniel promises God's presence. And Daniel promises a future and hope for us all. I think in our world, we are challenged so much to bow to a very subtle God with a small g. And it's so easy, and especially this time of year, so easy to get caught up in consumerism and spending beyond our means and all that. And I say this without any judgment at all, because I'm the same. We want to get nice things, we want to do things. We want to, nothing wrong with treats, by the way. Let me just put this out there in the slightest little bit. Nothing wrong with treats, stuff like that. But yesterday, Annie and I were talking about, what treats shall we get for Christmas? And I was like, I'm not sure, because I'm thinking, how good do I want to be? And I was like, just get us this. And then I thought a bit more and I went, actually, and get me some nice cheese. And if I'm getting nice cheese, then I want some nice pickle to go with it. And I want some nice crackers. And don't forget Leberkuchen, because I really love Leberkuchen. And suddenly I thought, hang on a second. I'm going to get it all, by the way. But it's so easy to get caught up in it, and it's a really subtle thing that we suddenly start to center on me and center on I, and not looking at who Jesus is in this. So he's all about the feast, so please don't mishear that. I'm not saying we've all got to have really frugal. I'm not Scrooge or anything like that. But it's about putting it into perspective. As strong as these kingdoms and empires appear to be today, they will fall and they will fail. One by one, these kingdoms will give way to the next. Pride is ultimately going to end. I think that's another one of our gods. I'm a proud Yorkshireman, which I am. Or I'm a proud Englishman, and therefore we've got to keep people out because we've got to, maintain our resources, and we've got so little, it's so scarce and so scary, and if we let them in, there's not going to be enough for it. But actually, there's plenty. I'll not start ranting. But we've got to know that there's one that will never pass away. Jesus is on his throne. He is never going to pass away. The Son of Man is coming again. And in the meantime, God's people are left to stand strong You are left to stand strong in the face of today's Nebuchadnezzars. And today's Nebuchadnezzar in the West at the moment is like I say, it's really subtle and gentle. Our brothers and sisters face something totally different in the other parts of the world. But this whole book is, in this history as we know it, he is a king who exalts himself. And Daniel ends with a whole passage towards the end of the book of Daniel about the king who exalts himself will be humbled. Pride is ultimately the thing that brings him down. And every king exalts and glorifies the kingdom that lasts forever. That's the truth that we stand on. With faces set resolutely toward tomorrow, God's people set out to plod forward until the day they might see one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. That's the great hope we have. That's what Advent's all about. That's why we light these 4 candles or fork handles. I don't know why I made that joke, actually. I never saw it in its original. I've seen it, but like, it was before my time. But, you know, it's still a cultural reference that we know, isn't it? But that's the book of Daniel. It's this beautiful, amazing book that's so rich and so deep. And I've not even touched on the eschatological stuff. But those chiasms, they just center us so much in what God is saying to us now and what God is drawing out to us. Amen. Amen. Bless you all.